This is a production of Cornell University.
So that gives you a fairly good overview of where this carbon is and what the carbon cycle is in organic matter. Let's actually talk about what's going on in situ, in the place of the soil. What's going on there? Okay? We generally perceive, how does this organic matter, in essence, get into the soil? We generally perceive decomposition, so the organic matter hits the soil, and what happens to it. Okay? We generally perceive it in this fashion. We have organic material that comes in. A lion's share of it is decomposed and blown off as CO2 through respiration. A very small component of it, 3 to 8%, basically goes into biomass. Now, historically, these two arrows would have forms. They would have pieces of information here. And this would basically say simple sugars and carbohydrates and stuff like that. And this pool right here would basically be saying humic materials. Okay? The reality is, with the last 5 years, these pools are not as clear as we thought they were. Okay? And that's what a lot of this lecture is going to be about today. Decomposition is basically taking organic matter, C6H12O6, representative organic matter, plus oxygen. This is respiration in oxygen, okay, converting into CO2 and water. Okay? Now, from that process, you get energy, but the reality is, from that process, you're also getting biomass and other wastes, not just CO2 and water. Okay? While the active building blocks of the organic carbon is CHO, and hence that's why we use this C6H12O6, not all the organic carbon structures are the same, and not all are easy to break down, and not all are easy to access. Okay, terminology watch. We're going to be hearing this a lot. Mineralization versus immobilization. Mineralization is basically the conversion of an element from its organic state into its inorganic state. So you're basically taking an organic molecule and degrading it into its elemental state, okay, its inorganic state. Okay? Immobilization is basically conversion of that element in its inorganic state and putting it into biomass. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Mineralization, you're basically turning it into a mineral. It's not quite the right term. Immobilization, you're basically immobilizing it into biomass. Question? What is biomass? Biomass is your body, okay, tissue of some sort, whether it's plant or animal. Okay? Questions so far? Cool. That tissue, that biomass, has a lot of different structures. And each one of these structures basically represent a different type of compound. Okay? Each one of these compounds have different structural arrangements of the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and the ash content. Some of them are nice ring structures. Some of them are simple linear carbon lines. Some of them are multiple ring structures. Okay? Important point here is when we start talking about decomposition, you're talking about a lot of different types of things being decomposed. Okay? Now, I threw this slide in here. These basically, this is this molecule right here. Okay? These molecules are not, in fact, the same. The carbon ring structures are the same, but the bonding angle of this oxygen between them are totally different. Now, why do I say this? For this molecule or that molecule to be decomposed, the organism that's doing the decomposition needs to have certain types of proteins. Okay? The protein that is required for this bind is very different than the protein that has to deal with that. Okay? Which means the organism, if they're going to decompose these, you either have two different organisms that each have their own individual protein, or you have one organism that has both of the proteins. Now, why is that significant? Why do you think this is significant?
You might have access to certain organic matter and not have access to other organic matter.
One very good reason is if this is what the plants are making and this is not, the organism that only has the protein for this and doesn't have the protein for this decomposition, this guy is out of luck. So the nature of the material is going to affect the distribution of the organisms doing the decomposition. Reason number one. Any other reasons? No? We'll go back to that. This is basically an expansion of what Andrew just said. If we think about the diversity of molecules that are out there, of organic molecules that are out there, we're talking about a very diverse community of organisms that are doing the decomposition. Okay? And then on top of that, if you throw what Andrew said in there, the distribution of this material in turn is also going to affect the distribution of the organisms that are doing the decomposition. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. Questions? No? All right. So let's expand that decomposition sort of graph, okay? Not graph, equation. Okay, here's the plant tissue. We start with the plant tissue. It's a wood. Okay, it's got a CN ratio, carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 100. Certain types of organisms are going to decompose it because they have certain proteins to be able to do that. Okay, those soil animals, imagine a termite or something like that, it's going to produce heat because it's biological activity. It's going to produce CO2, and because it's sloppy eaters just like we are, it's going to produce partially digested material. Okay, it's got its certain proteins to do the decomposition, right? Okay, this partially decomposed material is then going to be taken on by other organisms, bacteria or fungi, who are also going to produce heat, okay, and produce CO2 as well as biomass and energy, okay, and they're going to produce a secondary byproduct, in this case a humic, basically a reduced material, okay. Its CN ratio in general, we started with a CN ratio of 100, and now we got a CN ratio of 10. Okay, so in the decomposition process, they're not just getting heat, they're not just producing heat and releasing CO2 and biomass, but they're also changing the nature of the molecule that you started with. Okay? All right. In respiration, if it's aerobic, you basically take that carbohydrate or whatever that organic molecule is with water, CO2 production, and energy. Fermentation, I'm taking the same organic material, but I'm doing it without oxygen. My byproducts are very different. So here's another thing we need to think about. Okay, not only do I have to think about what type of organism is doing the decomposition and what type of organic matter I'm decomposing, but I also have to think about what type of environment the decomposition is occurring in. All three of those things are now going to affect the process of decomposition and the products of decomposition, right? Okay, now, in general, the rate of CO2 evolution, or the release of that CO2, is basically a measurement of microbial activity. The more CO2 I have, the assumption is the more microbial activity I have. Does that make sense? Okay, either that or I've got one really big organism. Okay? Now, the effects of that respiration, I'm going to raise the CO2 in the soil air by up to 10 to 1,000 times. Now, we talked about this earlier. Remember we said the soil atmosphere versus the atmosphere above the ground? Because of respiration, CO2 levels in the soil atmosphere are going to be elevated. The CO2 increase in the atmosphere in the presence of water is going to actually create carbonic acid, which in essence is going to be lowering the soil pH. Another environmental effect. That in turn can affect decomposition rates. Finally, because I'm lowering the oxygen rate, or the oxygen rate, I'm lowering the oxygen content, I may in fact be forcing from my initial decomposition from here to here. So I might in fact have temporal variations, not just spatial variations. Depending upon when this happens, initial stages might be in the presence of oxygen, latter stages may not. So there is a temporal framework here as well. Okay, questions? We cool so far? Okay. This all comes down to a graph. This is actually straight out of your book, a graph that looks something like this. Okay, let's start with the top graph. Basically, we're looking at time and amounts. Okay, on the top graph, we're basically looking at CO2. Okay, and we're using CO2 evolution as it goes up to basically represent microbial population. You remember me saying this before? You know, the more CO2 that I evolve, the more microbial activity I have. Does that make sense? So, oops, wrong way. If we think about it this way, as this material decomposes, this is a point right here where I add fresh material. Okay. As the material decomposes, what am I going to do? My organisms are going to start respiring because they're starting to eat stuff up. And if they're respiring, they're going to start breeding. Okay? And my population is going to build up. And if my population builds up, my CO2 is also going to be building up. So we're basically seeing right here an increase in activity and an increase in microbial community. Now, somewhere down the line, that organic matter is going to start running out. If they don't have the food stock, what's going to happen? They're going to start dying and they're going to start slowing down. And what happens to the CO2 levels? They start coming right back down. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, now let's put the feed stock in. Okay, here's that initial stage. Okay, we put some sort of new food in. Okay, now at that initial stage, we do in fact have organic matter in the soil already. Okay, now we'll talk about why this stuff is still here, but there is some there initially. I put in new fresh material. Okay, my population starts to increase and my food stock starts to decrease. Okay, as that population increases and more, my food stock starts decreasing. Okay, now ultimately, somewhere down the line, these lines are basically going to come in conjunction with each other, where I see a flat line here and basically a flat line here. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, now let's go back to this initial stuff that was here already. Well, what happens to that? Well, someplace in here, my population gets so large. Well, and they don't want to die, so they're going to find alternate food stocks. Okay? And as a result, what happens is my initial material actually has a drop. Okay? This drop is called the priming effect. It has to do, we don't know why. And this is a problematic effect, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay? But somewhere in here, as this food starts dropping, this population is increasing. They're going to find other sources of food. And so as a result, they start dropping this. Now, as they eat, there are byproducts. And those byproducts are basically going to be, and nothing's going to eat them, potentially. It's actually not true, but think about it this way. As in, I have a byproduct, what's going to happen to it? It's going to start building up. Think about when we eat stuff. We eat stuff, but we also have waste, and that waste builds up as we eat more stuff, right? Okay. Something else will eat that waste, but in this scenario, just imagine it's building up. So as a result, what's going to happen is here's my initial level of organic material, but because of all the waste buildup, I actually have more. Okay, it's built up. Now, somewhere down the line, if I added another food stock right here, this scenario would continue itself. It would just another similar scenario where I see an increase in the population, I see a decrease in the food stock, I see a priming effect, and then I see an ultimate accumulation of new organic material, waste material. Go.
Is the extra soil humus at the end due to like the dying off of?
Well, this material could in fact, and this is important, remember me saying organic material is a number of different things. This material in fact could be these guys dying. Because when they die, they're organic material, right? So they, in fact, could be part of this material. Now, old terminology, we basically called this all the same stuff. This was humic material. The reality is that the new information, this stuff is, in fact, not all humic material. In fact, a very small percentage of this is humic material. A larger percentage of this stuff is a mix of other types of materials, and we're going to talk about that next. Okay, questions? So the question was, that priming effect, is it a chemical or a biological effect? The understanding is that it's primarily a biological effect because we're looking at an increase in population and they're looking for alternate food sources. Okay? Now, the reality is that because of this change in idea about what this humic material is, in fact, that this is probably not complete humic material. In fact, a very small component of this is, in fact, humic material. And most of this is all different types of carbohydrates and sugars and things like that. The reality is we have to rethink what this priming effect really means. Because the major thought for the limitation of decomposition is actually not the structural nature of the material. It actually has to do with availability, location. Okay? And if we're building up this population, that population potentially can move. And if it moves, it might actually be moving in places that previously the population wasn't. And so as a result, they start eating the organic matter that's there. But that's not known. We don't know that. Any questions on that one? Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, now, traditionally, these are all, here's that pie chart again, right? Traditionally, these are all these different components of the pie chart. And traditionally, we thought the stuff at the top, the glucose, going down to the lignins, you're basically looking at a scale of decomposition. So as you go down, decomposition rates slow down. That's traditionally what we thought. And if you take these things and you put them into a container by themselves and you put organisms in there, that's in fact the results that you get. Okay? So there is in fact some sort of structural limitation on decomposition rates. But if we actually put this stuff in the ground, now this is out of Nature. Okay, this is a very recent article. If we put this stuff into the ground, every one of these are the chemical compound classes that we basically just looked at. Okay, that's these right here. Okay? Now, if we look here, lignin is way down at the bottom of this decomposition rate. So this should be the slowest to decompose, just based on its structure. Now we throw that into a soil, though. Okay? Here are lignins. The greens basically represent the residence time. So this is time here. Okay? Okay? And what you're looking at here is lignin. Between 0 and 50 years, all of the lignin is gone. Yet you look at some of these sugars down here, their residence time is a lot longer. So what's going on? I mean, if you look at this, simply look at this chart, the things that should be decomposed first should be the sugars, because they're easy to decompose. The lignins should be the last. Any ideas? I mean, I have a couple of them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're right. Go.
Maybe there are more organisms that can.
That's a good one. Maybe there are more organisms out there that can decompose this than this. But organisms tend to be generalists. There are some specialists out there, but there's a huge community of generalists out there. And if that's the case, it would be really hard to believe that something that gives you so much energy would be so resistant to decay because nobody really wants to eat it. Another idea, and this we don't have any information here, is potentially these molecules are more easily moved in the soil. And so as a result, they move to locations that are not necessarily available to the general population. Okay, remember me saying location. Okay, this really is, when we start looking at decomposition, it really seems to be a case of location, location, location.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.